Hi, my name is Graham Brookie, and I'm the Senior Director of the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council. And thank you so much for joining us today for this discussion. Today, we at the DFRLab are launching 3 reports that are a culmination of not only 1 year of hard work from across the DFRLab team, but indeed 7 years of daily monitoring of the information environment in Ukraine. This effort is very much a part of the DFRLab origin story. The very first project that the team that would become the DFRLab did back in 2015 was an investigation into Russian troops in eastern Ukraine, verifying at a time when the Russian government said that there were no Russian regular troops in eastern Ukraine. The team that would become the DFRLab did some basic OSINT, verifying things like selfies posted on social media and correlating that to what was happening in the conflict. Fast forward today, unfortunately, our team is still doing that work. And so the first report that we're talking about today is entitled "Narrative Warfare: How Russian News Outlets and the Kremlin Justified a War of Aggression Against Ukraine," and that articulates how we saw a number of narratives from the past decade utilized for purpose in the 60 days prior to the invasion to not only justify a war of aggression, but then also deny responsibility for a war that had not started yet, as well as masking military operations. The second report is called "Undermining Ukraine: How the Kremlin Employs Information Operations to Erode Global Confidence in Ukraine." And that's an articulation of what we've seen over the last year, since February 24 of last year, with the continued strategy of justify, deny, and mask military operations, but also with a sustained effort to undermine Ukraine's resistance, as well as support for Ukraine's resistance among nations around the world. The third report is from the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the DFRLab, and it's called "A Parallel Terrain: Public-Private Defense of Ukrainian Information Environment." And it's about tracking attacks on critical information, critical infrastructure that builds and underpins the information environment. And so today we're going to hear from 2 lead researchers from the DFRLab, my colleague Nika Alexieva, based in Riga, Latvia, and Roman Ozachuk, still based in Ukraine. And then we're going to have an expert conversation hosted by Amy McKinnon at Foreign Policy. Really looking forward to that conversation. If you would like to ask a question, if you'd like to participate in that conversation, don't hesitate to drop your question in the chat box or follow along on social media at DFRLab in particular. And I would encourage you to check out those reports at atlanticcouncil.org. And so without further ado, I really appreciate you taking the time to spend some time with us this afternoon or in the morning if you are in DC. And I'm happy to pass over to my colleague, Nika. Nika?
Thank you, Graham. Thank you very much. So I would really love to share some findings from the first report that as Graham mentioned. And because it's very data-driven, I thought slides will help us a lot. So yeah, without further ado, so this graph shows the pre-war disinformation-based narratives as debunked per stopfake.org, the Ukrainian fact-checking organization, and EU versus disinformation, the European External Action Services, the Eastern European Task Forces flagship product. So here you see 3 narratives that appeared not just the most often, but also most consistently throughout the 7 years period. And those being that Ukrainian army or military formations are brutal, Ukrainians are Nazis, and that Ukraine became a failed state after it followed Europe. All false statements, of course. So then, to zoom closer to the actual pre-invasion period, the 70 days before the actual invasion happened, first we selected 14 Kremlin-approved media outlets as per Medusa's investigation. These 14 media outlets were whitelisted on Yandex, popular search engine in Russia. And so we scraped every single article they published from mid-December until the invasion. narrow down the research scope, because we were doing it manually, and to end up with 10,000 articles for narrative analysis, we decided to focus our analysis around 7 events that we knew escalated the situation that led to the invasion. And these events essentially started from Russia blackmailing the West, demanding security guarantees, and pressuring NATO to go back to its 1997 borders. Then also recognizing Donbas republics. Evacuation followed amid the alleged Ukrainian aggression, which of course was supported by oftentimes false flag allegations about particular instances of Ukrainian aggression, as shelling of kindergarten in Lugansk, and also alleged chlorine tank sabotage that proved to be completely manufactured event. So we ended up having 5 overarching narratives, being Russia is seeking peace, followed by Russia has moral obligation to protect the region's security, and then Ukraine is aggressive, and the West is the one that's creating tensions in the region. The narrative Ukraine is a puppet of the West was the smallest one, and all other narratives that did not fit those 5 predefined buckets ended up making other narratives, mostly voiced by the Western leaders. For instance, Russian-controlled and approved media would report that Western leaders are ready for both dialogue, but also sanctions to deter Russia, or that NATO should protect security in Europe and Ukraine. Therefore, it's kind of aggressively oriented alliance, and other narratives that you can read on the slide. To dive slightly deeper and see what were the sub-narratives, for the narrative that Russia is seeking peace, the most popular sub-narrative was about the security guarantees that Russia is ready for a dialogue with the West. At the same time, Russian media claimed that Russia has moral obligation to secure peace in the region, so it needs to help Donbas refugees that fled the country due to alleged Ukrainian aggression. And regarding the Ukrainian aggression, of course, it was understating that Ukraine is already attacking Donbas, or that it's planning to attack Donbas, the latest being more popular than the first one. And about the West inciting the tensions, the claim was that NATO should stop expansion as that is threatening Russia, and that in general, the West never respected Russia's security concerns. Therefore, it's offensive alliance in its essence. And the more minor narrative that US controls Europe and Ukraine was mentioned just over 100 instances. Here are the rest of the narratives, mostly voiced by the Western speakers, channeled via Kremlin-controlled media outlets, which shows that Kremlin media wasn't only focused on Kremlin talking heads, but also covered some statements by the Western politicians. So the main conclusion is that these 14 Kremlin approved and whitelisted on Yandex media outlets acted more reactively than proactively. As we see for reporting, they were reporting in more he said, she said manner. There was also no unusual cross-amplification patterns, meaning that when these 14 outlets were citing each other, most often they refer to RIA and TASS, which are news agencies. And this is what they are been made by design to be cited and to be the primary source of information for other media outlets. And of course, we correlated these narratives with Putin's pre-invasion speech and Donbas recognition speech, and these narratives overlapped quite a bit. All of these predefined narratives, we identified about 200 instances when they were used. So the message was quite coherent that Russia is seeking peace, but it cannot ignore situation. incited by the West and executed by the Ukraine. That was the story. And we can back it up by analysis of over 10,000 articles. With that, I'm happy to hand over to Roman.
Thank you, Nika. Yeah, I will also share the screen. Everyone, it's a great pleasure to be here today. And yeah, let me just start the presentation. So I will be presenting the second part of our investigation called Undermining Ukraine. And here we've mostly focused on the tools and the techniques that Kremlin and pro-Kremlin sources conducted since the start of the invasion almost 1 year ago on February 24th. So let's take a closer look. First of all is the constant evolution of disinformation, meaning that they used multi-layered approach when one false story was based on a few other false stories, creating this like kind of layered cake of some falsehoods, giving some credibility to the story on top, but where in reality they are all based on some false information and disinformation. Like for instance, there was a forgery of the letter claiming that Ukraine is selling weaponry to the African countries. Back in April, the letter itself was complete forgery, but then in a few months it led to the publication of the French Twitter user claiming that Ukraine lost to French donated howitzers called Caesars that were reverse engineered in some factories in Russia. And then months after that, there was a blog post in English claiming that those actually howitzers were not lost. They were actually sold by Ukraine to some to Russians, basically. All of these messages were actually heavily debunked, but it didn't stop this final piece and point of this to claim and build up on the previous messages and previous disinformation. The second thing is exhausting information space. It's not something specifically new because they use the same tool and the same approach in MH17 case when they came up with multiple different theories out there. And the main idea here is just to overexhaust people who are reading news in order to make them actually puzzled with what actually happened and distance themselves from thinking of what really happening and taking any decisions. So it was, for instance, with the case with Kramatorsk railway station shelling when a lot of civilians got injured or died, unfortunately. So what Russians first mentioned that they shelled Ukraine armed forces, but when they realized that civilians were caught and actually injured, they changed the messaging, trying to promote an idea that it was Ukrainian missile that hit the Ukrainian military, which is again was not true. Or the well-known case of Bucha massacre, right, when the MOD of Russia and Russian state media claimed that the videos from Bucha when there were bodies on the floor actually claimed that they were moving, trying to pretend that it was played by actors, when in reality, unfortunately, it was all true, and all of these things were tried to kind of deny Russian atrocities when in reality they took place. Forgeries. Again, it's not something new, but what we found is that there was an industrial level of forged material. Russians have a history of forging different materials, like in our previous reports of the secondary infection and our colleagues in the field. But since the February 24th, the scale of it was extreme. So they forced everything from they created deepfakes of the Zelensky claiming to stop fighting. They also stole branding of reputable media like BBC, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, or Al Jazeera, pretending that those media are actually claiming the same narratives that pro-Kremlin media are trying to promote, and where in reality those media never published those videos. So this is kind of in search of external validation by some external sources, but they never happened. Next thing is the forgery of documents. So Ukrainian government documents, Polish governmental documents, multiple array of different documents were forged and spread through social media, claiming different things from the intent of Poland to occupy part of the Ukraine to Ukraine selling weaponries. Or even false fact-checking, when the notorious war on fakes actually used the fact-checking toolbox to promote propaganda and sometimes even invent their disinformation, quote unquote, that they tried to debunk in the final place. And also, disinformation was audience specific, so they tied their messages for specific audiences. For instance, in Poland, they aimed anti-refugee rhetoric and highlighted some history, meaning that they aimed at refugees because Poland actually hosted most of the Ukrainian refugees since the start of the invasion. For the European Union and the United States, they promoted an idea that Ukraine is an unreliable partner and it's selling the weapons that you are donating, so it's not feasible to have dealings with them. Or if you would help Ukraine further, there would always be a new option. So that's what they're trying to promote every time. For the global south, they used the whataboutism and anti-Western rhetoric, claiming that Russia is fighting anti-imperialist war, when in reality Russia was basically an empire and actually tried to impose their power over the neighboring countries. And finally, they used embassies and social media of the embassies as the propaganda arm. So if you go to different countries, you could see basically that they are promoting the same stories and the same disinformation narratives all across the world. And that's it from me. I'm still sharing.
Thank you so much, Roman. And hello, everybody. Good morning in Washington. Good afternoon to those of you joining us from Europe. My name is Amy McKinnon. I'm a staff reporter with Foreign Policy Magazine, and I'm going to be your moderator for the next session. We're going to have Nika and Roman staying with us to talk about their reports. But joining us, we also have Ksenia Iliuk, the co-founder of Let's Data. We have Terrell Germain-Starr, who is a non-resident senior fellow with the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council and founder and host of the Black Diplomats Foreign Policy podcast. And we're also joined by Lyubov Cybulska, founder of the Center for Strategic Communication and Information Security. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. And as a reminder to our audience watching around the world, you can send in your questions for our guests using the chat function on your screen. So staying with our report authors for a moment, Nika, I was really struck reading your report, something that you and your colleagues found that in Putin's speech announcing the invasion early in the morning of the 24th of February, you found more than 200 instances of him referencing these falsehoods about Ukraine and the situation there that had been promoted in pro-Kremlin media for years. And I think you can really see how effective this is, right? Like the media lays the groundwork in the minds of the public, the president echoes these ideas, seemingly driving them home. And I know this is beyond the scope of your immediate report, but what is your impression of the relationship there? Because I feel like I've heard varying explanations of how this works in Russia, that these narratives are explicitly handed down from the Kremlin, while others have said that the Kremlin kind of plays the mood music, so to speak, and the media kind of rises to follow what they think is what the Kremlin is looking for from them. What's your understanding of how that ecosystem works?
Yes, indeed. There are a couple of ways information reaches readers through Kremlin-controlled media outlets. Of course, there is top-down approach. There are reports about regular briefings done by Dmitry Peskov, the spokesperson for Vladimir Putin, when he meets the editors-in-chief of major Russian media outlets and briefs about in quite, I guess, relaxed manner, what are the issues that concern Kremlin, meaning that probably these should be part of the agenda. Then we also know, based on leaked documents and reports published by independent Russian media outlets now in exile, about so-called temniki, or the particular instructions for media outlets on the wording, on the other particularities that media outlets should use when reporting, covering some events. For instance, when there were explosions on Russian territory not far from Ukraine, Kremlin media pro-Kremlin media, including Kremlin-owned media, of course, started using word chlapok, which is more softer version, like much softer version that no one would ever use to explain an explosion. And that was consistent over many media outlets. And of course, there is also a level of self-censorship by the journalists and editors, because we constantly read reports about Russian journalists or activists who are jailed for a simple act as holding blank page as a sign of protest, or also journalists disobeying the direct storylines and ending up fired, being the least punishment sometimes. So yeah, self-censorship, of course, especially throughout this last year, was really probably the most effective mechanism for media's regulation. That, of course, takes some releases some free energy for Kremlin to deal with other things, including influence operations on global audiences.
And staying with you for another second, Nika, I was struck by what you found to be the most common narratives in pro-Kremlin media about Ukraine. I mean, I think we're all very familiar with this lie that Ukraine is overrun with Nazis as the justification for the invasion last year. But that wasn't actually the top narrative that you found. Were you surprised by that?
Yes, I was surprised that the Nazi or fascist claim wasn't used to explain events, because our analysis for articles was very driven by events that we selected. That this argument wasn't used to explain such events as Russia's security guarantees from NATO or recognition of Donbass. Yeah, it was mostly the kind of hardcore hot war aggression that was used to justify such events as evacuation from Donbass, and evidences being the completely fabricated allegation about the chlorine tank sabotage, for instance. We found some tens of articles that used the claim that Ukraine is run by Nazi regime, but it was much less than we would expect.
That's fascinating and really surprising. Roman, I want to bring you in now, because I know you looked at the kind of international dimension of Russia disinformation about the war in Ukraine, the invasion. Can you talk us through how these narratives have varied depending on the country or the war, the country or the part of the world which is being targeted by this disinformation? How do they tailor it for different regions?
Yeah, thank you. They used, first of all, the infrastructure that was available in each region, meaning that in the European Union, let's say RT and Sputnik was blocked, so they could not use that. So instead, they used some French media conspiracy-leaning people or anti-Western minded people just to spread their messages in those networks. So they kind of created some messages that were translated and injected into those audiences. And as I said, for Europe, it would be messages that Ukraine is an unreliable partner. So definitely, you should not look, Ukrainians are selling weapons. You should not actually donate even more, or that your help is actually extending the war, and many things like that. For the global south, as I said, there are a lot of messages claiming that actually first of all, there is some kind of preferential treatment for Ukrainians as refugees, and as a country, there is too much attention, and United States launched many different conflicts before. Why you're not taking attention to this one? Why are you actually focusing on this? And so they basically tried to promote different messages that would stuck with specific audiences, meaning that, let's say, for the LATAM, they would also use the infrastructure that was in place, like RT and Sputnik, and for the global south in general. And they would promote the general news like biolabs. Ukraine wanted to produce weapons of mass destruction to attack Russia. So basically, it's somewhat corresponding with what Nika said, but even after the invasion, they tried to explain what's happening and why they attacked in the first place. But again, they try to make it more consistent and targeted for the respective regions.
Tyrell, I want to bring you in now, jumping off of something that that Roman mentioned, that one of the narratives that Kremlin disinformation has used in the global south has been about preferential treatment of refugees from Ukraine. I know you were in Ukraine during the invasion and you covered very closely the refugee flows moving into Europe, and particularly the experiences of Black refugees leaving the country. I'm wondering if you can talk about some of the challenges that they experienced and how that differed from those experienced by white Ukrainians.
Well, definitely. Thank you very much. And also, I just wanted to commend the report. I think it's very thorough, and it definitely outlines a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that we have seen and brings into picture. I just wanted to add on to it is that one of the main challenges in fighting the Russian disinformation is several-fold. One, for the simple fact that Russia has been engaging in it a lot longer, and Ukraine itself does not have any of the infrastructure and the apparatuses to adequately and equally combat it. Obviously, because far fewer resources, and Ukraine is actually in a war for survival. And so, in addition to the lies that it spreads, you're fighting a conventional war, and you're fighting a disinformation war. That's one basic thing. In my reporting, I'm working on an 8-part series called Fleeing Ukraine While Black. One of the challenges in this is that while the Kremlin has been spreading lies and engaging in disinformation, there were a number of concerns of African refugees that have been true. The challenge is that they were not ever addressed. And so we all remember those scenes from the first week of the war where Black people were kind of pushed off these trains. Unfortunately, some of these stories were true. Did this happen widespread? No. The problem is that at the beginning, it was just never adequately addressed or adequately discussed in a culturally competent way to say that, listen, we know that you experienced these things, which would happen during a war, sorry about that, or whatever the case may be. What was happening was that with a lot of the stories that were legitimately true and were legitimately tracked by legitimate organizations, they were just flat out denied in a reflexive defensive stance to say that this is just Russian propaganda. So and getting caught up in the legitimate propaganda, legitimate concerns were just flat out ignored. And so in the dozens of conversations I've had with students and with people who lead African-based organizations, the conversation is that we see this sympathy from the West in Europe. And again, another legitimate concern is that for many Ukrainians, they see the West and the EU as their allies. For on the continent of Africa, they see them as long being colonizers of their region, which is true. And there has not been a competent way from either the Ukrainian side or even the West in adequately dealing with that. And so, and even in the diplomatic corps, Russia, even though they don't care about the financial and economic stability of Africa either, which is something that is in the report and is explained perfectly well, what is also true is that a lot of the African leadership are saying, why are you coming to us now, right? And there's also a lack of respect for a lot of African leadership's intelligence to know that they know Russia is playing them as well. And so it's a very complex web of everyone, including Russia, is exploiting them, but it's a continuation of exploitation that has left a lot of these African nations vulnerable as well. And so the next task in dealing with disinformation is creating a competent infrastructure within the Ukrainian diplomatic corps, as well as the disinformation aspect of it. In addition to sending Ukraine F-16s, ATACMs, whatever they need, there also needs to be resources for Ukraine to fight back on the disinformation front as well.
Thank you, Terrell. There's a lot in there that I want to put to our other guests here. Ksenia, I'd like to bring you in now. I think Terrell touched upon something really important, which I've heard disinformation researchers speak about for years now, which is that the Kremlin is very skilled at playing off of our own weaknesses or the weaknesses of whatever country they may be targeting with their disinformation. In the context of the United States, that has been, they've really honed in on things like racism and prejudice within the country, really an Achilles heel of America, but then running with that as a disinformation narrative. Looking at this from the perspective of Ukraine, which has perhaps more experience than any other country in the world in dealing with Russian disinformation, what are the best strategies in your view to deal with this, where they're taking these kernels of truth, but then they're spitting it out into a whole disinformation narrative to advance their own agenda?
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you, dear colleagues, for the great reports that you came up with. Outstanding work. And I will start by saying that indeed Russia is very skillful at finding our own weaknesses, weaponizing them against us, and exploiting it. And so that's what we actually saw at the beginning. Like, just to go back one year in time. So back then, with the start of Russia's full-scale invasion, our team was monitoring information environment basically 24/7. So in the first days of full-scale invasion, like almost during the first months of full-scale invasion, we were identifying around 35 unique pieces of propaganda and disinformation per day. So unique. So I'm not even mentioning their scale, their reach, their flows, and so on and so forth. Like, the amounts were actually huge. And I myself, we've had like various data points before full-scale invasion showing that the resilience of Ukrainians to Russian hostile information campaigns is growing, is strengthening. But at the same time, I myself, even working in the field, was very terrified of that enormous flows of propaganda and disinformation actually coming from all of the channels like social media, websites, and so on and so forth, targeting Ukrainians. And it's very hard, especially when you hear the bombs outside of your window, to adequately make the decision making and stuff. So the flows were crazy, but Ukrainians showed this enormous resilience, even the time of the crisis. So what Ukrainians did as the community actually is that first, the realization that Russian propaganda and disinformation is a threat became like the first shield to it. So there was like a huge, like this common realization that this is a threat, that this is something that could literally kill us. And tones of Ukrainians, just average Ukrainians, so-called average Ukrainians, without any background, even in understanding how communication works, they were very much committed, because for them it was personal, to spread the truth, to amplify the truthful narratives inside of the country and outside of the country. So Ukrainians were the ones who were just doing the most amazing things, when it comes to pre-banking, debanking, and various formats of communication, and just sharing their stories. So basically, and all combined with different, this personal resilience of Ukrainians, this understanding of a threat, the good cooperation of civil society, the state that was smart enough to amplify those very truthful narratives that were coming from the bottom of the society, and not where just like, there was never in Ukraine a situation, and my colleagues from Ukraine could confirm it, where we as a civil society sat down together with the state and like, okay, so what would be the narratives? There was never like a case like that. So it was all very, very organic, and the support of Ukrainians were very crucial in it. So of course, Russian propaganda disinformation is very aware of that, because just in April, the social polling of Ukrainians showed that despite all those enormous flows of propaganda and disinformation, almost 90% of Ukrainians fully believe in Ukrainian victory, which is the great illustration that Russian propaganda has been failing, in Ukraine. And of course, Kremlin realized that. So it started adapting the narrative. So the goals kind of remain the same, like to make Ukrainians give up, to not see the point of fighting, and so on and so forth. But their elaboration of it has been changing and developing. Like, for instance, so it started with saying that Ukrainian army is weak, Ukrainian state is weak, you know, the most famous Russian narrative about Ukraine being a failed state, which included the messages about like Ukrainian government being corrupt and stuff. So it was mainly pushed through this. They're like, Ukraine is gonna lose because and this and this and this and this. So when they saw it's not working, they started spinning it even to the degree that they were started saying that Ukraine is gonna fight till the end, and that's bad because think about all the resources that Ukraine would have to put. Think about all the Western help, and think about how all of you are gonna suffer, like both Ukrainians and those who are supporting Ukraine all around the world. So they've started even spinning it like that. And another example is about undermining Ukrainian leadership. So they started with saying that you probably saw this notorious fakes of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky doing lines of cocaine in his office, you know, and things like that were like kind of crazy at the first glance. So that's how they wanted to show that, oh, Ukrainian leadership is incompetent. So that's why Ukraine gonna fail. But then they completely twisted it to saying, like, actually, especially starting from June, we've seen the, starting from June till now, the presence of the narrative that Ukrainian government is actually so strong that Zelensky himself is kind of a dictator, that Ukraine is allegedly controlling information environment completely, that Ukraine is allegedly like the center for the psychological operations for the whole globe. So they kind of switched to the other things. So I would just say that Russian propaganda and disinformation, and to conclude with that, is indeed a threat, and it can be very, very sophisticated. But it's also very important to look at information environment comprehensively and to see that it's not always working out, it's not always finding an audience, and the productive, truthful narratives has its way out there. And just a final number to give is that in August last year, we've been monitoring the information environment in almost 40 countries worldwide. And we've seen in August that the amount of space that the narrative that Ukraine is going to win took place for the first time in a few times more than the narrative that Russia could win this war. So I think we have to be way more optimistic.
Thank you, Ksenia. And I want to bring in Lyubov now. Thank you for your patience. We have a lot to cover and a large and very distinguished panel today. Going back to Roman's report about disinformation on the international level, there's been a lot of coverage of how Russia's narrative about the war is really making inroads in countries, beyond Europe and North America. I'm wondering, what's your assessment? Do you think that enough has been done to arrest the progress of these narratives? And is there more that Ukraine can do, Ukrainian diplomats to do, to get the Ukrainian truthful narrative about what is happening in the country out to the rest of the world?
Thank you so much. Thank you for this discussion and for your researches. This was very interesting to listen to you. And these researches once again proves that Russia was systematically preparing for the attack. Russia was preparing both its own domestic population, infusing it with hatred, dehumanizing Ukrainians with propaganda, but also preparing the international audience, international community as well. In 2017, I worked for the Hybrid Warfare Analytical Group, and we did a research called Image of Europe in Russian Media, and then Image of Ukraine in Russian Media. And now I see that basically these narratives you sounded today, they were the same back then. And we, back then, we calculated, literally counted all negative mentions of EU countries and Ukraine on Russia's main 3 TV channels, fully controlled and fully financed by the Kremlin. And our conclusions back then were that the average ratio of negative to neutral positive news about Western countries on Russian television was 86 to 14. And Russian media were deliberately creating an enemy image of some countries. All the narratives we see today are basically, as I said, the same narratives we have been seeing for last 9 years. And in 2017, we toured the EU countries and the United States presenting that study. And our goal was to explain that the purpose of this aggressive propaganda is to prepare societies for the major war. And at that time, only those who had some common history with Russia, Baltic states, Poland, Nordic states, they took our conclusions seriously. And even then, we could see signs of genocidal rhetoric. Even then, we saw the infusing societies with such narratives that would lead to dehumanization. And now, especially in Russia itself, we see the consequences of this. We see how a huge part of Russian population has become complicit in terrible war crimes. We know that what Russian army is doing to the civilian population while occupying territories is the result of propaganda, violence, and hatred. And we have the testimony of Russian soldiers who admit explicitly that they received calls to kill, torture, and rape from the Russian media. And coming back to your question about other countries and whether it's enough or not of our efforts, I think that I just came from Indonesia a few days ago, and I had a trip there, and the goal was to explain what this war about. And I was so much surprised that, for instance, first of all, Russia's influence is very strong there. And for instance, the narrative that Russia is the global protector of Muslims is very strong as well, which is very surprising to all of us here in Europe, because we all know a lot about Chechnya, about Syria. And like, as people who have been analyzing Russian domestic propaganda, we know how humiliating the rhetoric towards Muslims is in Russia. So I don't think that it's enough, but at the same time, I do understand why we were putting so much effort on Western countries in explaining what this war is about. Because we cannot keep our focus on the whole world. We just don't have enough resources for this. But now situation is changing, and I see clearly that Russia is trying to impose a narrative that there is West, and this war is the war of West against Russia, which is pretty much understandable, for instance, here in Ukraine, but it's totally different in the countries of Global South, because the Western countries are predominantly colonial for them, and there is this resentment, and then Russia kind of suggests and invites these countries to join anti-West coalition. And in Indonesia, for instance, I saw that they believe in the narrative that if this war is against NATO, then we are taking, of course, Russia's side because we are against NATO. So we have to explain definitely more that it's not about West and anti-West. It's about human values. It's about democracy. It's about civilized world, right? It's about the world's order we have right now. And if we allow Russia to be a bully in the room, then it will be a very strong sign to other authoritarian and totalitarian, and I believe that Russia is no longer authoritarian but totalitarian state, that it is okay to behave this way. It's okay to threaten others with nuclear weapon and to basically spread this, power of strength. It will change the world's order completely, and democracy will be the first victim of this. So I think that the understanding that we should do more in these countries is coming. It's slow enough, unfortunately, because we all, as I said, were focused on the Western countries, but now we understand that in a longer perspective, we have to bring more people into these countries to explain and to reshape our narratives, not to be focused that much on the Western narratives. Thank you.
Tyrell, I could see you vigorously nodding along there while Lyubov was talking. Do you want to jump in with something?
Yeah, sure. Definitely. I share sentiments completely. I'll just say that it's difficult to spread lies about people when you build community with them. And so when you think about the continent of Africa, the next stage that Ukraine has to engage in is community building. For all of the wrong reasons, in many respects, Russia, has used its propaganda to build community. That's one of the things that propaganda does over the years. It takes those kernels of truth and it just really blows up the lie. But there's community built in that because there is a grievance. Of course, we know that Russia has been killing and sending off Muslims, for centuries. In fact, at the beginning of the war, when all the casualties from the Russian side were coming in, if you just look at their last names, you know that many of these soldiers were mobilized people who came from the southern regions of Russia. So we know that part, right? And so we know that the Russians don't care about Islam. The issue, and I just want to reiterate, is that ultimately the West, Ukraine, has to do a better job of telling their truths than the Kremlin tells its lies. That has not happened yet. And again, there has to be support for Ukraine, not only when it comes to fighting Russian disinformation, but building communities on the continent of Africa, which is germane to my reporting, that are based on mutual interests. And it just can't come at a point where the whole world is galvanized around Ukraine and then you come to Africa and say, help us. Because in my own reporting, that is the perception. There is a lack of engagement. There is a very superficial mindset of we're just going to teach you about, these are the lies that the Kremlin are told. And I don't have to tell anyone on this panel this, but the general view is that, Africans are across the continent are intelligent enough to know the difference between a lie and a truth. The problem is the lack of engagement on the issues that they genuinely care about. And until that is adequately addressed, then the Kremlin will win and they do not have to.
Thank you, Tyrell. I'm now going to bring in some audience questions. We have some fantastic questions coming in the Q&A. Many for Roman, actually, a lot of interest in international dimensions of Kremlin propaganda. Let me see, many to choose from here. There's one from Ella Bowie, sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong, Ella, who asks that we've seen a wave of pro-Russian sentiment in Africa in states such as Mali and Burkina Faso. Could you speak to some of the narratives that are being spread by Russia in this region and what kinds of media are they leveraging to do so?
I can start. Yeah, so I cannot tell specifically about those countries because it's a team effort, and the report is a team effort. So we have researchers who are focusing on Africa directly, and they could address those questions better. But from what I've seen, they were as I previously mentioned, right, the anti-imperialist kind of narratives first, and the second thing that happened there, what I've seen is that Russians tried to use the famine and the grain supply problem when they blocked the ports of Ukraine. They promoted the story that there might be shortages of the grain in a few African countries, not due to the war or because Russia shelled Ukrainian ports or just blocking those trade and actually exports, but because the European Union actually got all of the grain from Ukraine and is not sharing it with other countries, meaning that the trade is happening, but it's not happening specifically with the particular countries. So this is a way to raise the hostility towards specific countries on the West rather than real problem and real perpetrator of this problem, Russia, right, who blocked those ships in the first place and did not allow the trade happening. As of now, it is started happening because there were like some agreements and those ships went, but at the beginning there was narratives like that.
Thank you, Roman. We have another question. I'm going to put this one to Nika, which comes from Sergey. He asks about the Russian war correspondence. Sergey says he's seen reporting that they can sometimes deviate from the Kremlin's sanctioned narrative while still having a huge reach. Have you looked at their role in Russia's propaganda apparatus?
So the report mostly focused, it focused on pre-invasion period. I see how these war reporters, especially very Russian chauvinist and nationalistically oriented, are now criticizing Kremlin for doing too little atrocities. But we did not spot any of that before the war. Probably because there wasn't the war, and criticism was like basically the intentions of Kremlin really aligned with Russian nationalist wishes for basically acquisition of Ukraine and probably, unfortunately, genocide of Ukrainians.
That's a phrase I never want to hear. Not committing enough atrocities. We have a question from Kat Yampolsky. I'm going to put this one, I think, to Lyubov. This is an intriguing idea, one I've never heard before. Kat asks, how effective is pre-bunking Russian disinformation? And is it more effective in certain regions or for certain narratives than others?
Pre-bunking meaning that you're letting know about Russian disinformation in advance, right?
I think trying to preempt claims that you expect they might make.
It is maybe even more effective than debunking, because then you kind of warn people about the danger, and once people see this narrative, they immediately recognize that it's false narrative. So I do believe in pre-bunking because it's sort of like a vaccine against disinformation. But again, like, it should be done in the right way, of course. Thank you.
I mean, to follow up with my own question on that, I'm curious, do you see a distinction between pre-bunking and just getting out accurate, truthful narratives?
I think it's a little bit different, because when you spread truthful narratives, it's basically strategic communication, right? When you spread something positive or truthful, and pre-bunking, it's when you warn people about intentions of your enemy. When you allow them to know, to learn and understand what your enemy aims at, and it helps people to, as I said, recognize false disinformation in the flow of information.
I'm going to stay with you for this next question as well, Lyubov. This one comes from Martina, who points out that a particular narrative that Russia is spreading in many parts of the world is about peace. Russia claims everybody wants peace, but what Russia means by peace is territorial concessions and a threat to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. How do you see this narrative playing out in different parts of the world? How effective is this claim that the Russians are for peace?
Unfortunately, it's one of the most effective narratives I observe. I visited the General Assembly in October, and we met our delegation of civil society representatives met with different representatives of the countries of Global South, and many of them, they were speaking about peace, saying that that Ukraine is willing to kind of continue bloodshed. You know, the Ukraine wants to continue to fight while Russia wants to stop the bloodshed and to negotiate. And unfortunately, many governments even do not understand that negotiations at this point would only give Russia opportunity to strengthen its army, to regroup, to rebuild, to mobilize more people, to infuse more hatred, and then attack us again, and maybe not only us, not only Ukraine. So, but it sounds, for those who are not very familiar with this whole issue, it sounds very logical. You know, the one country wants to have negotiations to bring peace, and another country rejects this offer. So I think that nobody wants peace more than Ukrainians, and Ukrainians want to come back their homes. Nobody wants to be a refugee. Nobody wants to live in some shelters in other countries. And if you look at all pollings, they all shows that Ukrainians want to come back. They don't want to get some payment in the EU countries, for instance. They want to come back to work and live their lives here in Ukraine. And yes, we do want peace. It's not a joy to live your life accompanied with air raids around constantly and to observe explosions. Basically, in Kyiv, even, you know, we have it once or twice a week now. So Ukraine wants peace, but we don't want peace on Russian terms, because we do understand that it would mean even more of sufferings.
Ksenia, I want to get your thoughts on something that Putin touched upon in his address to the Federal Assembly yesterday. It was a long, hour and a half long speech, you know, from a president who is at war, who is an international pariah, who's under international sanctions. There was a lot for him to cover, but I think a lot of people were struck by the fact that he took time out of his address to talk about what the Russians describe as family values in the West, and to rail against gay marriage. I know this is something that you and your colleagues have looked at. I'm wondering if you can, and it's something that I think for observers that is also very puzzling, is why Putin does this. Could you speak about how the Kremlin, how Russian propaganda outlets have used and exploited issues of identity around gay marriage and LGBTQ rights, and how that ties in with the war in Ukraine? Help us make sense of this.
Yes, that is indeed something that could be quite striking in all of this. However, if we look into in details in the nature of Russian-aligned information campaigns, we understand that weaponization of gender and sexuality is actually one of the building blocks for it. Because in this way, what Kremlin does is it creates this kind of a world with here we are, the saviors, versus the so-called rotten West. It's the way, what is fascinating in a bad sense, but still what is fascinating is how they manage, you know, to connect the small events to this big kind of a mindset that they push, that they are fighting NATO because allegedly, according to the big analysis that we did with over 100,000 posts in Ukrainian and Russian segments of different social media, identifying different pro-Russian narratives, claiming that allegedly every NATO officer wants to make every Russian kid gay, or the things like that Ukrainian female refugees are only good for prostitution, and that Ukraine should use the prostitution to avoid collapse of the economy and things like that. And they were using like very small events happening, you know, to prove this kind of of standing. They were using this kind of fake stories about Ukrainian soldiers, claiming that Ukrainian soldiers are male soldiers are raping other male soldiers, and so on and so forth, to create all this big thing. But the most striking is that they do not only create this kind of vision, us versus them, which is quite understandable, especially for the war, because that's how it has always been. But what strikes me most of all is that they are using it as a call to action. We've identified, pushed by pro-Russian sources on social media, calls to rape Ukrainian women, calls to kill Ukrainian gays. And that is what's striking. And they managed to combine this call to this big imperialistic vision of Russia, and to this feeling of Russian army and Russians that they are doing good for the world. That in this kind of doing, that they are the ones who are saviors in this. So I think this is actually, even though it's hard to understand, but this kind of propaganda and disinformation is heavily, unfortunately, it finds a lot of answer from Russians. And that's why one of the reasons why Putin actually focuses in his speech quite a lot.
Thank you, Ksenia. And we are at time, unfortunately. I'd like to thank our guests, our report authors, Nika and Roman. I strongly recommend that you check out their reports on the DFRLab website. And thank you also to Lyubov, Ksenia, and Tyrell for joining us and sharing your expertise today. And thank you to our audience joining in from around the world and for your excellent questions as well. Thank you, and stay tuned for more events like this from the Atlantic Council.